Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Sizzling Summer Series. This is the 2022 Sizzling Summer Series sponsored by the UNMC College of Public Health, Office of Public Health Practice, in partnership with the Midwestern Public Health Training Center. My name is Jessica Chavez-Thompson, Project Coordinator for the Office of Public Health Practice, and I'm also joined by Julia Quigley, and we will be your hosts today. This is our fourth annual summer series focusing on communicating the value of public health. Today marks our third and final webinar. We will be focusing on building bipartisan support for public health, evidence-based policies and practices that promote health and reduce health disparities may seem nonpartisan to those of us on a mission to protect the public's health. However, many public health professionals find themselves needing bipartisan strategies to garner stakeholder support. Fortunately for us, our three guest speakers today are experts in public health policy and advocacy and will be able to share practical insights, lessons learned from the field, and tools for communicating the value of public health across political divides. Our first speaker is Jill Krieger. Jill serves as the director of the Network for Public Health Law's Northern Region Office. Her current work involves climate adaptation and mitigation, the Farm Bill and agricultural policy, rural health, oral health, literacy, and mental health promotion in school and community settings. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Chrissy Giuliano. Chrissy is the executive director of the Big Cities Health Coalition, a forum for the leaders of America's largest metropolitan health departments to exchange strategies and jointly address issues to promote and protect the health and safety of the communities they serve. Welcome, Chrissy. And finally, we will hear from Vicki Shabo. Vicki is a senior fellow for paid leave policy and strategy at New America. She is a nationally recognized expert and advocate for paid family leave and medical leave for every working person in the U.S. She works closely with policymakers, advocates, researchers, and business leaders on policy design and advocacy strategies. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, we have just a few housekeeping items. For today's webinar, all participants will remain muted. However, we do encourage you, per usual, to put any questions or dialogue in the chat box. And with three amazing speakers tackling this very important and difficult topic, we do plan to hold time for your questions until the end of the webinar. My colleagues and I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A to ensure questions are heard from our guests, by our guests today. We also invite you to evaluate your experience at the end of the webinar. There will be a short survey provided via email following the webinar. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Jill Krieger from the Network for Public Health Law.
Thanks so much for having me, Jessica. And I'm really pleased to be here with the Sizzling Summer Series and with my fellow panelists. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so as Jessica mentioned, I'm an attorney with the Network for Public Health Law. We are part of a coalition called Act for Public Health. That's a number of public health law organizations across the country. And Act for Public Health was launched just about a year ago, partly in response to the backlash that we saw to the exercise of public health authority to contain the COVID pandemic. Many of these authorities were long-standing but rarely exercised, and so people were surprised to learn that public health, the executive branch in particular, had as much authority as it did. So there has been a backlash. So when we talk about building bipartisan support, sometimes I think it has felt like there's been bipartisan lack of support, critique, condemnation, questioning. We've seen threats and harassments against public health officials, sort of forced resignations and retirements. I don't have to go through the whole litany. So we have been focused on some of that legal reaction, but I'm here to say that there's also some hope. And so I'm just going to talk through some of what's been happening in the state legislatures, as well as some messaging and advocacy tips. Not too much to say about this. This is a mask burning, a protest in Boise, Idaho. And again, this is the context that we've been living in, many of us, where it's, the idea of having bipartisan support might seem like a pipe dream. And so what's driving this kind of backlash and this kind of animus? Well, what we've been doing at the network in collaboration with our partners like the Center for Public Health Law Research and Change Lab Solutions has been tracking what's been happening with the bills. And when I talk about what's been happening with the bills, in 2021 and 2022, there were some 1,500 bills in legislatures across the country to limit public health authority. And so we've been tracking those. Now, only a small portion of those was actually enacted into law. So that's the first hopeful point, I think, that while there has been this backlash, not all of it has made it all the way through the legislature unscathed. But what kinds of bills have these been? How would they limit public health authority? The first, we've detected 5 trends. So one of these trends is shifts in authority, which would move legal authority from one level of government, say from the local level up to the state level, or one branch of government, say from the executive branch to the legislative branch. Another type of law limiting public health authority that we've seen enacted has been limits on public health and executive orders. So, some of the closure orders, the stay-at-home orders, school closures, business closures, closures of houses of worship, as well as mask and vaccine orders, although we've tracked those separately. We've also seen bills to increase deference to individual constitutional rights. So the rights to peaceful assembly, the rights to free exercise of religion, the right to bear arms. And typically in our legal system, we tend to balance individual rights against other individual rights or against the common good. But we've seen a flood of laws introduced that would really essentially recognize absolute individual rights, which is frankly impractical. And part of what I think the opportunity there is to discuss that with legislators and build their understanding about the need to balance different interests. We can't really have an absolute individual right to go about unmasked or unvaccinated if that implicates the individual rights of immunocompromised individuals. And so part of what I think builds bipartisan consensus is just introducing nuance and slowing the conversation down. Okay, so we've talked about 3 trends so far: shifts in authority, limits on public health authorities, deference to individual constitutional rights. And then we did dive more deeply into specific proposals to block requirements to wear masks, as well as laws to prohibit government entities from requiring COVID vaccination. And some of these haven't even required qualifying for an exemption. Most of these laws have focused on limits on requiring vaccination for COVID. Some of them have been broader and have threatened just public health authority to require vaccines generally, which is a really long-standing and basic public health authority. So there's work to do to shore up and rebuild the consensus that had previously existed around some of these types of legal authority. And so what we turn to then is, well, how do we strengthen public health and public health authority? And some of the factors to think about, down at the bottom, public health orders, but also more broadly, thinking about funding, infrastructure, workforce and workforce training, health equity and cross-sector approaches and building that vision. And what we've also been doing is tracking bills to do this kind of thing. So we've seen, limited targeted legislation to actually strengthen authority around vaccines and masking, or clarify that authority. But we've also been tracking more broadly bills to do things like secure funding. And so happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but in states like Washington and Oregon and Massachusetts, there have been multi-year campaigns to really build advocates and champions in the legislature. And those approaches have differed from state to state. So it's not a simple formula of here's the law that every state should adopt, or here's the message that's going to work in every state. For example, in Washington state, the approach was to focus on foundational public health services and really, over a course of a number of years, educate the state legislature, establish a list of foundational public health services that should be available to every citizen of the state of Washington, which ended up being a strategy to garner support, in urban communities and rural communities and suburban communities. But in contrast, a neighboring state, Oregon, really focused on what they called public health modernization. And so rather than focusing on public health services to be provided by the government, it was really a focus on how can the government partner with communities and empower communities through funding, through technical assistance, through relationship building, empower communities to provide some of those key community health and other community health education and other services. So I think part of the message is that there isn't a cookie cutter approach. It has to be tailored to the political, economic, and social culture of a state. And it might take time. Some of these bills that we've been tracking to limit public health authority were enacted very quickly, as many of you no doubt know, and without a lot of nuanced discussion and without a lot of thought about implications and how a measure that seems sensible to the proponents with respect to the immediate problem that, as they saw it related to the COVID response, without a lot of consideration how that might limit response to foodborne illness or waterborne illness or natural disaster or the like. So part of this is that slowing things down, and kind of my exhibit A for a strategy for slowing things down is in the state of Indiana, where the governor, by executive order, created a public health commission. And so that public health commission created a place outside of kind of the political furor of the legislature to really consider the public health system as a whole, to consider things like infrastructure and funding and workforce, rather than, oh, my constituents are angry about having to wear a mask, to really take that more comprehensive view. Now, all of those recommendations, that Public Health Commission has just released a report at the beginning of the month with a host of recommendations. It's a lengthy report. The governor's office and the State Department of Health will boil that down into legislative proposals. So those proposals and the conclusions of the commission will still be subject to the legislative process, but there's been that careful groundwork. There's been that careful consideration of a multiplicity of viewpoints, a multiplicity of public health, challenges and opportunities. So I do, think that's a nice example of how to rebuild a consensus, across party lines, or maybe not a consensus, but, more of a general shared understanding of what public health is and does and why we need it. I'm happy to talk more about that. But so the point is, part of proposing, advocating for public health is being able to articulate a positive vision, not sort of just being in a defensive posture, responding to criticisms, but really working to have those, develop that vision and be able to articulate what that vision is so that, responding to a policy proposal, whether to limit or strengthen public health, you're not just limited to responding to that specific policy idea, but you can place it in a broader context and how it supports or diminishes or threatens to diminish community health. Now, I'm not a messaging, I'm not a communications expert. I'm an attorney, but through this work, especially, I've been a public health lawyer for 12 years or so, but particularly through this last year or two of really diving into the response, to the COVID response, and then the response to the response, the backlash. We have worked with partners, both within Act for Public Health and with the Berkeley Media Studies Group. We've looked at some of the work of Jonathan Haidt, and we can share links for some of those materials. We have gleaned some important lessons learned. And one of the things that BMSG, which was formerly known as the Berkeley Media Studies Group, talks about is the need to move from portrait to landscape when you're talking about public health. And partly that's based on their observations when they looked at media coverage of the pandemic or of any public health challenge. It's often really focused on the individual. And what they say is to tell the story of public health, you have to talk about the landscape. You have to talk about the community as a whole. So move from portrait to landscape to have the most powerful impact. Begin with values, really not just focusing on specific policies, but really focusing on those core values to connect both with liberal and conservative audiences. Invoking analogies. How is public health like the fire department? Do you prepare for a fire, after the fire has started, or are you buying those fire trucks and fire engines and maintaining them in advance of the fire? And just emphasizing the need, not that you need power, but you have to do your job, that you need the legal authority to do your job. So let me see. I mentioned Act for Public Health, so that's our collaboration, the Public Health Law Collaborative. So this is just a side to set forth the partners. We've got a link, and Jessica can share that on the website or in the chat. Other than that, here's my contact information. I want to respect handing things over to the next presenter, but look forward to the discussion after everybody is presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. All right. Next up, we have Chrissy Giuliano, Executive Director of Big Cities Health Coalition.
Great, thanks. Can you see my slides in the full version? Yeah, great. Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here and talk with folks about this. Would be great if I could actually move to the next slide. There we go. So really briefly, the Big Cities Health Coalition is a forum for leaders of America's largest metropolitan health departments. We have, you'll see on the next slide, 35 members. We were founded 20 years ago. This year is our 20th anniversary, really around the idea that there's something unique and different about big cities, big city health commissioners, and sort of what I've learned in my 8 years with the coalition is also really the scope and scale with which big city health departments can do their work. So I don't need to read you our mission and vision and our goals, but what you can see is that really all of these pieces focus on the urban health, equity, and then relevant to today, one of our strategic goals is around advocacy and working to better the public health system. So as I mentioned, these are our members. Just this past year, or earlier this year rather, we expanded to 35. You can see those highlighted. And together, these jurisdictions serve more than 61 million, or almost 1 in 5 Americans. So just to give you some context, these are the issue areas that we work on. And again, we really try and focus on both the niche of urban public health and then how we can tell our stories and raise up what's going on to better the public health system as a whole. No matter what we're saying or advocating for, even if it is sort of city or urban specific, it's also looping in, and this is why we need to better support the public health system or something like that. And so, as I was saying, we do a lot of federal advocacy, ranging from routine check-ins with various parts of the government, talking to congressional staff about what's going on the ground, thinking about, just have to move there, thinking about what's needed to continue to support the public health system. So, for example, along with many of the public health partners, we all advocated last year for really talking about getting money into the hands of local health departments and state health departments for the COVID response, and looking at what sort of workforce and infrastructure pieces were needed. And really a big win for sort of our members and other local health departments was that many of the upcoming CDC funding opportunities are now funding some local health departments directly. So, we've really struggled with getting those dollars local, and we're going to continue to talk about that. So, sort of the 5 key things I want to share today around this concept are the idea of nonpartisan versus bipartisan, telling that public health story, which I just mentioned. It's critical, and what we say and how we say it matters. I really appreciated Jill's comment about positive and proactive and offensive. I think too often public health is on the defensive. So I'll talk a little bit about that too, and I'm going to use some of our work as examples of this. The 4th point is thinking about avoiding false dichotomies, so rural versus urban. For example. And then the last point, which I know everybody on this webinar probably gets, but I want to sort of talk about a little bit from the federal perspective. Our public health system is only as strong as its weakest link, and that's why we really need to make sure that that the federal government resources the field. Okay, so this is a little bit of a soapbox of mine, so I'm going to start with that disclaimer. When I first talked to Jessica about this webinar, it's like, well, let's start with the premise. So nonpartisan versus bipartisan. And again, I think, it's not that we don't know what this means, but I sort of wanted to ground us. Nonpartisan is obviously free from party affiliation, bias, or designation. Bipartisan is of relating to or involving members of 2 parties. So I think in our field in particular, we often conflate these, and it is absolutely 100% important to be nonpartisan. I think how we manifest our work in thinking about bipartisan can sometimes hinder our work. So, for example, for many years, and I think this is worse now in the current environment, but for many years, we've talked about doing advocacy or meeting with members of Congress, or even giving awards like, you're a public health champion. And many different places that I've worked or, been involved, or things I've been involved in, after you have identified a champion in one party, the next question is, well, who's the champion in the other party? And, this sort of what I would call a box checking exercise. And so a couple of things related to that. I think, first of all, that's getting really much harder to do in the current environment. And so we need to be careful what we do in our work, and that we don't dilute our message or the mission, in sort of that box checking exercise. I think the other point, and I'll share this example of some work we've done. So we do a lot of work on gun violence prevention. We were offered the opportunity to partner with what is somewhat of a political organization, and we had to have a tough conversation with our funders, our members, our internal team to figure out this difference between, well, are they partisan? Are they bipartisan? And really, we landed on we're going to do this work together because it was the right thing to do and we weren't crossing any lines. And I think that leads me sort of to this other point of partisan versus political. I think in an ideal world, we'd all suggest that public health be not political, but I think at this point in our lives, that's a little bit naive. And I think one of the challenges that COVID has presented is the idea of partisan versus political. So we're now in this place, right, where public health has been made to be partisan and political rather than just political. So, I don't have the answers, but I think these are important things that we need to consider as we think about what we share and how we share it and with whom. So, my second point was telling the public health story is really important. And we at BCHC do a lot of media for the purposes of getting that story out. I think the fact that, the COVID-19 and public health have been both a blessing and a curse, right? So for so many years, so many of us have been frustrated with nobody sees public health, nobody knows what public health does. And now everybody sees public health and everybody wants to understand what we do. So I think, the opportunity is continuing to share successes, continuing to share what we all do in local communities every day, and recognizing that more people are watching. So we need to be careful how we say things. This slide is focused a little bit on how we talk about things with members of Congress or congressional staff, not as much the media, but thinking about how we talk about public health matters. Some successes we've had working across the aisle, particularly with Republicans, are these ideas around accountability, local work and preparedness and national security. Now, I just want to reiterate, we don't water down what we're talking about with folks. We just sort of target, for lack of a better word, what we're going to share. So I 100% believe that certain parts of our system need to be more accountable, right? We need to know where federal dollars go in states and local communities. That's a message that, generally speaking, Republicans respond to. And so, if that's going to both get us in the door and perhaps make some progress on our work, we're going to have that conversation. Similarly, I talk a lot about big cities, and sometimes I talk about local communities, and sometimes I change how I say it. But generally, this idea of what happens local, is really responsive on the Hill. And lastly, preparedness and national security, even 20 some odd years after, 9/11, this really is still a concept that does resonate more with some than others. The not quite the birth, but the beginning of public health really being part of preparedness and thinking through this national security piece was post 9/11, when health departments had to deal with things that they were not previously thinking about. So, we continue to raise that up and talk about those important pieces and public health's role in it. I think the other piece of this is the frame through which we tell these stories. And so I'm going to highlight a little bit of work that we are doing to illustrate that. And I'm going to start talking faster. We put out an urban health agenda a couple months ago, Cities, the Future of Health, really to articulate a lot of what most of us in public health know, my next slide will go, there we go. Health is more than health, right? So not only is health more than health care, but all the other pieces that are at play in a community affect one's health, housing, the economy, livable wages, access to, safe, well-resourced schools, and earned and paid sick leave. And I know that we're going to hear more about that from Vicki, but all of these pieces are how we build healthier communities. So I don't necessarily need to talk about the public health system has to do X. I start to talk more holistically about how we build that healthier community and pull in those other pieces. And, I think the other piece of this is thinking about who the right messengers are when you're trying to reach certain folks. So sometimes I'm the right messenger. Other times I call up one of our members and I say, I really need you to talk to this person because you can share that local perspective. Or talk to your mayor, talk to your city council members, or even your city lobbyists, right? There's always, depending on what we need to share, and we need to figure out how to share it. So my fourth point was about false dichotomies. So I really think, again, I've been in my position 8 years. I have learned that it is not rural versus urban, that we really need to think about the levers in both of those communities. Sure, most of my time is talking about big cities, but what I've observed is that we have similar challenges, like take opioids and substance use disorder, for example. Cities have struggled with this for, 2 decades. And just in the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen these other challenges in rural communities. So this is a sort of a natural partnership in thinking about how we move, whether it's legislation or resources at the federal level, forward. So we need to think about, how, again, what levers can be pulled by my big city members or other folks sitting in different places of the country. I think the other, one of the other important pieces of this is everyone has a local structure and has local politics, and thinking about, again, how those help or hinder and where you can really put them into play. So for example, of our 35 members, a little less than half of them are true cities rather than county health departments. And they report to a mayor or a city council, they report to a mayor. So dealing with the mayor and the city council in some ways gives them some authority and autonomy that maybe if you're sitting in like a really large county, you may not have. So, thinking about how you can get your message out and get the most done given your setting, I think is critical. So my last point, and again, this should not be a surprise to anyone on this webinar, but thinking about the whole of the public health system, the box here at the top are different pieces of the governmental public health system, and caveat being not everyone is there. But, really thinking through the federal agencies that most of us in governmental public health deal with the most, CDC, FDA, HRSA. And then you see sort of the different boxes for the laboratories and state and local health departments and tribal health departments. And then, our private sector partners. So together, we are what we refer to as a public health system. But no, that part of that system is only as strong as the weakest link, as I mentioned. And so the federal government really is at the top of this in how they resource activities. And I think this is one of the most complicated messages I have as an advocate when answering questions like, well, why should the federal government pay for it? Why can't the states? Why can't the cities? And, or why does the federal government still need to be supplying COVID vaccine? Why can't local communities or states do it on their own? So really articulating the fact that there are just some things that, at least in my opinion, are 100% federal responsibility that states and localities cannot take on themselves. And so sharing how that impacts local communities and states with elected officials and others, I think is really important and shows that this is how we can move our work forward together. So that is all. Here's all my various contact info. Happy to answer questions after Vicki's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. And finally, we have Vicki Shabo from New America.
Hi, everyone. While I'm getting my slides up, I will just introduce myself. My name is Vicki Shabo. I am a senior fellow for paid leave policy and strategy at New America, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. I sit with a team called the Better Life Lab, which has as its goal advancing work-family justice. And that is deeply related to public health as well, individual health and community health. So can you all see my screen? Is it working? Okay, I'm going to assume that this is working. I'm just going to talk today about a specific example of a policy that is too often thought of just as a workplace policy that is deeply, deeply related to public health. And having you all think about this issue in a way that can help to communicate to policymakers the importance of enacting paid family and medical leave and programs in your states and paid sick time policies and requirements in your states and cities will go a long way towards improving public health and health compliance.
Vicki, just a quick note, are you able to, for display settings, swap so that we can see the presentation? And right now we're able to see the notes, so it's just a little bit small for the slide.
Oh, huh.
So up at the top, there's a menu option that says display settings, and you should be able to then swap which screen shows which.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. None of us on here is new to the.
I'm sorry. Well, so what are you seeing right now?
Right now, we're seeing the PowerPoint software.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what about right now?
We see the presenter where we can see your notes.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's
So
get rid of that.
Yep.
Sorry, so sorry.
So up at the top there, do you see a display settings just above? So next to show taskbar, there's display settings.
No, I don't have that. I don't think. Here, well, let's do it this way. Let me just use the PowerPoint. And is that
Wonderful. Way to troubleshoot.
okay? Actually, maybe is that better?
It's a little bit small, but I think we can work with it.
Okay, I'm so sorry. And everybody can have these slides afterwards.
Oh yeah, no worries. I have a feeling you will all be wanted back.
Okay, so I want to
Continue.
first just make sure that we're defining terms that we're talking about. When we talk about paid family and medical leave, we're talking about weeks or months to recover, heal, treat somebody or get treatment or provide or receive care. This includes family leave, which can be maternity leave, paternity leave, adoptive parent leave, can be caregiving leave to care for a seriously ill, injured, or disabled loved one, or it can be medical leave for your own serious health issue. This might sound familiar, and as the bottom of the slide shows, this is related to the Family and Medical Leave Act, which provides guaranteed job protected leave with health benefit continuation. You all may be familiar with this, but it's unpaid. And it has restrictions, which means that it only applies to about 56% of the workforce. So when we talk about paid family and medical leave, what we're talking about is creating a program that covers all working people, regardless of what type of employer they're in or whether they work part-time or full-time. And it would provide wage replacement during the time that they are away from work. This is often thought of as something that would be required of employers, but the way that the 11 states and the District of Columbia have set it up is as a social insurance program. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. The other policy that's really important is paid sick time. This is hours or days for a routine illness to seek health services. During COVID, it was time to quarantine or isolate. These are generally put in place when they are legislated as requirements that employers provide an hour of paid sick time for some amount of time that people work, usually 30 or 40 hours. So the most important thing to know is that access to paid family and medical leave and access to paid sick time are rare. Just 23% of workers have designated paid family leave at their jobs. And as hopefully you can see by the the graphic here, the disparities are very pronounced by wage level. Only about 7% of workers in the bottom decile have access to paid family leave. And the disparities have actually been growing over time as employers are providing more paid leave, for paid family leave for their very high wage workers, their professional employees, but workers at the bottom of the wage spectrum are not being provided with the same types of benefits, and yet they often have more family caregiving responsibilities, worse health, and more need for access to paid leave. Just 42% of workers have short-term disability insurance through a paid medical leave program through their employers. And even with respect to paid sick time, even having come through an unprecedented public health crisis, only about half of service workers, people who are interacting face-to-face with the public, have access to paid sick time. Where we have seen growth in access to paid sick time, it is because of the now 38 or so jurisdictions that require it, about 14 states and 26 cities and localities. There are significant disparities in access to leave by race, by immigration status, by among people with disabilities. And in particular, rural communities are often disregarded in this conversation, but they have less access. Workers in those communities generally have less access to paid leave. During the pandemic, they were more likely to have to report to work in person, have lower quality jobs. So this is an area of particular focus, and I think really could help to transcend some of the partisan divides that we see among policymakers in the future. So this is a quiz. I'm sure all of you know the answer to this. We are the only OECD country, the only high wealth country that does not guarantee paid leave for new mothers. We're one of 5 that doesn't have requirements around paid leave for new fathers. We are one of 2, us and South Korea, without personal sick or medical leave. During the pandemic, Congress authorized some limited paid sick and childcare leave, but it expired at the end of 2020 and it wasn't renewed, despite dramatic health effects. So the emergency paid sick leave that was enacted did have a significant impact. So this is just sort of looking at what it costs us to do nothing. The emergency paid sick leave that was enacted is estimated to have prevented 400 cases of COVID per state per day, or an estimated 15,000 cases of COVID per day, but it expired, it wasn't renewed. 15% of workers during the pandemic said that they left work because of caregiving, 8% left for a personal health issue. And of course, now we have tens of millions of people who have long COVID, who also, many of whom will not have access to leave, which creates problems for employers. It creates economic problems and health problems for workers. In the before times, before COVID, the cost of inaction with respect to lack of paid leave for new parents meant that 23% of women were back at work within 2 weeks of giving birth. This obviously has significant public health implications and individual health implications with respect to postpartum, depression, breastfeeding, immunization rates, all of the things that go along with raising healthy families and having healthy parents. About $300,000 per worker is lost when older workers leave work to care for an aging parent. Medicaid use in nursing homes actually goes up when paid leave is not available. And in contrast, in a state like California that has paid family leave in place, nursing home use and Medicaid costs went down. Families lose tens of billions of dollars on aggregated in wages due to inadequate paid leave. The average family loses more than $9,500. Families are forced into poverty that takes years to recover from when they don't have access to paid leave. And that, of course, affects health as well as a number of other things. And then finally, as we rebuild from COVID, we need to think about how we bring women back into the workforce, how we ensure equitable employment for people of color, how we address the fact that more than 1 in 5 adults cares for an older adult, a child, or both, and how we navigate the coming care responsibilities that fall on Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z as the population ages, but there are fewer and fewer people of working age to provide care to family members. So the flip side of this, some benefits, and I mentioned a bunch of these already, so I'm not going to go through it, but one thing I do want to say is the benefits for businesses. Often opponents in particular of regulation frame paid leave policies, whether we're thinking about a paid family and medical leave social insurance program or business focused requirements that paid sick days be provided. We think of this as a burden for business, but actually the evidence shows quite the reverse. Businesses became more favorable towards paid family and medical leave in states that have it during the pandemic because they saw the difference it could make. Small businesses benefit when we have policies in place that guarantee paid leave to all, that spread the costs and actually allow smaller businesses to hire replacement workers or otherwise cover the work if they need to. And for paid sick time, presenteeism goes down, contagion within workplaces goes down when paid sick days are provided to employees. So as I mentioned, we've seen some progress. Some of this has been bipartisan. There are now 11 states plus DC that operate paid leave programs or will soon operate paid leave programs. Washington, Oregon, and Massachusetts were adopted with bipartisan support among policymakers, in part because of a threat that there could be a ballot campaign. And so that brought unusual stakeholders to the table to negotiate very, very strong policies. In Colorado, voters decided on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis to adopt paid family and medical leave at the ballot in 2020. And counties that were Trump voting counties also voted to put a statewide paid leave program in place in Colorado. Some of you may be in states where public sector workers have access to paid parental leave, if not to the full suite of paid parental and family caregiving leave. This is a strategy that red states in particular that haven't been able to do private sector social insurance programs at least have put in place to cover some workers and start to change the culture around leave taking, which is a very important thing that needs to happen in order to smooth the pathway to more adoption. We obviously need a federal program. We thought we were going to win a federal program as part of the Build Back Better federal Biden agenda and the Democratic agenda in Congress, and it, along with many other things, got kicked out of the package. So in the interim, until we have the next opportunity to take a run at federal policy, we've got to keep building power and success in states. Unpaid sick days, there are, oh, sorry about that. Forget this Maryland and Delaware thing at the bottom of there. And I just actually, sorry, hang on, I'll go back. There are about 14 states that have paid sick time laws, a number of localities. Some of the localities in this 54 wins got wiped out when statewide laws passed in Oregon and New Jersey. But needless to say, this is, again, good for public health, good for families, good for communities. So one of the things to look out for, and I think particularly now, we're going to start to see some further debate about paid leave and some discussion about paid leave. What I think is important for folks to know is that the words paid leave don't necessarily translate into good policy outcomes. So we often hear, and in fact, at the federal level, there is a tax credit in place right now for private sector employers that choose to provide a minimal amount of paid family or medical leave. We haven't actually seen any expanded increase in worker coverage as a result of that, and it's been in place now for about 3 years. And we have seen some conversation about parental leave or maternity leave only policies that would ask workers to borrow against their own future security. So whether it's using existing Social Security to fund a paid leave and then have a worker delay their retirement and have less generous Social Security benefits down the road, or an advance on the child tax credit and have workers pay back that tax credit over the next 10 years. These are policies that are not likely to be effective and are actually hurting the very same people who need both paid leave and greater financial security. So a few things to keep in mind as you're seeing paid leave and paid sick time proposals maybe come up in your legislatures. Help you think through what can you support from a public health perspective and how can you help bolster support for universal, mandatory, inclusive policies. So this chart just shows, like, we want a policy where all employers and all workers are covered. Voluntary incentive-based programs don't work. Access to leave open to everyone in a job protected way, not something that's available as an option, but doesn't provide any additional employment protection. We know that actually employment protection paired with paid leave is a very important aspect to getting workers, particularly workers who are more vulnerable to being laid off or fired, to be able to take the leave that's available to them. Wage replacement, making sure that all or most of a worker's typical wages are replaced so that low wage workers can afford to take the leave that might be available to them. What we've learned from California and New Jersey, which were the first two states that adopted paid family and medical leave programs, was that wage replacement rates of 55% or 60% are too low for workers to be able to use. In terms of inclusion, making sure all people of all genders are covered for parental leave, and ideally, as in all of the states that have passed paid family and medical leave programs, that also these policies cover not just parental leave, but also caregiving for a loved one. Again, something that's going to become more and more important as the population is aging, and care for workers' own serious health issues. About half of the utilization in states and under the federal FMLA is for people who are taking paid leave to care for their own serious health issue. And again, with a bunch of long COVID sufferers now in the workforce, this becomes more important. And then finally, eligibility, making sure that part-time workers, contract workers, full-time workers, and newer workers at the job are all covered. The current FMLA, as I said, only includes about 56% of the workforce. Some of that has to do with the size of employers that are covered, hence the importance of covering all employers and all employees. And some of it is because the FMLA requires someone to have been on the job for at least a year and to have worked 1,250 hours in the year, so more than part-time. So last point here, is this a bipartisan issue? Among voters, unequivocally, yes. This is just one poll, maybe the latest poll, that shows the incredibly high support for paid family and medical leave. It routinely polls with 3/4 to 80% of adults and voters supporting a national paid leave policy, an inclusive paid leave policy. And it is almost always a bipartisan support in polling. And you can see that here. And actually, this is a poll that stacks up some of the policies around care that were cut from the reconciliation bill that just passed against those that were included. And you can see that these care policies are tremendously popular, as popular or more popular than the policies that passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So one final point here, sorry, is Dobbs. Obviously, there are now a growing number of states with restrictions or bans on abortion. It's important to know, and I'm sure many of you are aware, these are the same states that have tended not to extend Medicaid to cover birth expenses or postnatal care. These states do not have paid family and medical leave programs, and only one has a paid sick time law, Arizona. Very few of them offer childcare or pre-K or tax credits, and they're also states with higher than average rates of maternal mortality. So this just heightens the urgency for adopting family-friendly policies, including paid leave. So just some key takeaways in terms of messaging. Everyone deserves time to care, recover, and heal. Everyone deserves the chance to see their baby's first smile or hold their parent's hand, to get the cancer treatment or the other treatment they need to recover and get back to work. Paid leave protects public health, improves individual health, and shrinks health disparities. It's pro-family, it's pro-business, and it strengthens communities. This should be a no-brainer, and it should be a bipartisan initiative everywhere for legislators, as the way that it is for voters. And so I hope you will all take the time to become advocates. I shared with Jessica some examples of the American Academy of Pediatrics taking a stand on this, the way that some individual healthcare providers have weighed in, and would love to follow up with anyone who's interested in learning more.
Thank you so much, Vicki and Chrissy and Jill. We're getting up to the top of the hour, but for those of you who are able to stay on, and if you have some questions, we'll take up to 3 questions depending on the length of the response. If our panelists are able to stay on, they'll stay on. And I just want a quick reminder for anybody who does need to sign off that there will be an evaluation coming your way in the email following. So for now, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. You can use the Q&A feature within Zoom, or you can chat your questions now. I imagine everyone is absorbing the loads of information that we received across 3 different experts. Since we are at the hour and this was a very full presentation, I was hoping that for anybody who does have, oh, thank you, Laura. For anybody who does have questions following this, would we be able to send those to you 3 offline? We've had that opportunity before and have been able to include responses to those questions in our landing page for the summer series. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So if there are no questions right now, as a reminder, you are able to contact us, either myself, Katie Brandert, or Julia Quigley with any of your questions for the presenters today. On behalf of the Office of Public Health Practice and the Midwestern Public Health Training Center, thank you for attending our final session of the summer. Have a safe and healthy end of your summertime, and we will see you all next year for our 5th Sizzling Summer Series. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.